My great-grandmother, Sophie Zunni, is easily the most important person in my life. She's seen 118 years and has been through so much in her long life. She was born in Russia, in Moscow actually, in 1904. She was a member of the Russian ballet until she left for America in 1924. She danced and taught ballet once she established herself in America, and now she supports the arts in her old age and helps instructors in getting the most from their dancers. I've been living here since I was 16, my parents having died in a car crash. During that time, I've heard many stories about her life in the New York Ballet, the Chicago Ballet, and her adventures as her troupe toured the New World that was such an enrapturing thing for a young girl fresh from the harsh Russian landscape. Of Russia, though, she would say nothing. She wouldn't talk about her first 20 years of life. It was as if she couldn't bring herself to relive that part of her. No matter how I prodded, she refused to tell me anything. At least, until last night. I woke up around midnight, my bladder bursting. On my way back to bed, I noticed that great-grandmother was sitting in the living room. She had a roaring fire built in the grate, something I was curious about since all the wood was in the backyard, and she was sitting close enough that I was afraid she might go up in flames. I ran in, reaching for the water bucket, but her wrinkled old hand reached out to stop me. "Don't. I like the flames. They remind me of my girlhood." I sat down with her, afraid she might fall in, as she sat and stared at the dancing fire. "They dance as I used to when I was a little girl." I was quiet for a moment, her voice spidery and thin. When you were in Russia?" I finally asked. She nodded. "I studied under Madame Jeunesse Grutiev, one of Russia's finest instructors. She claimed to have performed for the Romanovs in their day, though she never said which Romanovs. She was old when I met her, but she molded my young body into the dancer I am today. Madame Grutiev was responsible for training many great dancers, most going on to dance for the Moscow Ballet. But she was old. People wanted younger dancers to teach their children, teachers who could still demonstrate the techniques without falling on their palsied backsides. My mother was no fool, though. She had been trained by Madame Grutiev and wanted her daughter to receive the same training. I went on to dance for her troupe for 16 years, eventually becoming a teacher in her studio. They called me Lady Zunni when I took the stage. I was the darling of the ballet in my season, and my star seemed on the rise. She paused then, her eyes drinking in the flames as she stared it down, until the fire. She began to tell me her story, and as I watched the flames dancing in her glassy eyes, it seemed like I could see the movie of her life playing out just for me. The studio had a legacy of excellence, but that brought us very little money. Madame Grutiev owed money to some very bad people who didn't like unsettled debts. They had offered trades for more time, wanting her girls for the usual things that brutes want a young girl for, but Madame Grutiev protected us from them. But these were not the sort of men to be balked. They blocked us from getting work, and Madame Grutiev was getting desperate. She was still making money from the lessons she taught, but her students were also becoming less and less. Some of it was the men she owed money to, but some of it was her age. Parents appreciated a teacher who could demonstrate their craft, and Madame Grutiev was old. Her legs were gouty and unsteady, and her gait was even then not so good. My friend Louise and I did most of the teaching, but we were losing girls to other troupes. With these men blocking us from getting work, we had little money to pay the rent on the studio, let alone her debt. But life offers opportunities sometimes, cruel as they may be. Madame Grutiev received an invitation one day. An invitation to take part in Vladimir Stropokov's latest ballet. Stropokov was a genius in Moscow, though his performances were often as experimental as they were outrageous. I remember hearing that one such show had been held in the forest by night, all the dancers performing naked in the snow. Many of them had suffered hypothermia. A few of them had even gotten some frostbite. Still, the show had been heavily attended, and the profits were said to be substantial. Madame Grutiev said that the price he had offered her for 3 dancers would likely pay off her debt, and then some, and Stropikov had asked for Lady Zunni specifically. I've never heard of the performance, but it's highly anticipated and could only raise your star higher. She chose Louise and Georgette to accompany me, her 3 best dancers. We were excited to be in one of Stropikov's shows. They were often odd and sometimes dangerous, but many of those chosen to perform went on to have great success in the Moscow Ballet and beyond. Rehearsals were scheduled for the week to come, and we practiced in our free time so that we wouldn't disappoint Madame Grutiev. We arrived early at the designated practice space, only to find that it was being held at Vladimir Stropikov's estate. We were shown into a large receiving room to wait, several of the girls already present. We spoke with them for a time, the other girls arriving as the appointed time grew closer. Finally, Mr. Stropikov arrived to speak with us personally, and the room grew instantly still. He was dressed in a luxurious dinner coat, a soft pair of pinstripe pants adorning his thick legs, and he looked like a sultan in a children's play. His caliph-like slippers were pointed, elvish in their design and softness, and he seemed to exude charm and affluence.
I am glad that so many of you have come to join my little production. I have called 30 of you here, but will only retain 15. 15 of the best will take part in my production of Moths Aflame. I look forward to seeing what all of you bring to the table, especially the enchanting Lady Zunni.
He winked at me then, seemed to pick me from the crowd, and I felt honored to be noticed by someone so affluent. What a little fool I was. The following 2 weeks encompassed the most demanding audition of my life. Stropikov put us through our paces from dawn till dusk, sometimes making us dance and rehearse for hours on end. He cut 5 in the first hour, 2 others before the day was over. He made us dance naked on the first day, watching us as our bodies moved and making notes of where we could improve. After the 3rd day, we were allowed to wear our leotards, and he made us run through the woods like deer on a hunt. He cut those who didn't run gracefully enough, another 4 girls, and as we bent double, gasping for air in his backyard, he smiled wolfishly.
You do not disappoint, dear Lady Zunni. I knew you would be the one to give my performance fire.
It took 4 more days of grueling drills to ferret out the last 4, and Georgette wept as she was sent away on the last day of trials. After that, the true work began. We were fitted for costumes, the fabric gauzy, and the material slightly oily. It sat against the skin like mud. It made my flesh crawl. It felt greasy, and Louise told me that it made her break out in a rash. As we began to dance in them, I could feel the way it grated against me. It made me think of sandpaper, or maybe burlap, but it was always soft to the touch when I removed it. It makes sense now, but by the time I figured it out, it was far too late. We practiced and rehearsed for the next month, Stropikov's critical eye always upon us. When the night of the show arrived, we were all aflutter with anticipation. We peeked through the curtains as they filed in, women in furs and men in suits. All of them wore mysterious lacquered masks, and they looked ghastly as they leered at the stage. They sat like ghosts amidst the low light, watching with anticipation. In our costumes, we resembled moths. In my stomach, it felt like a swarm was swirling in an anxious cloud. I felt like it was my first time on stage again, and I had to remind myself that this was no different than any other performance. When Stropikov called to us, we gathered for final instruction.
Good luck tonight, my beauties. Tonight's show promises to be the highlight of the season. I am certain that all of your stars will shine brightly this evening.
He smiled hugely, a secret joke that only he understood. Then the curtain came up, and 15 pallid moths began to mount the stage. The stage was circular, rimmed with oil lamps that burned low in their holders. Above us, something hung like a grand chandelier, and as we took our positions, I saw it slowly descend over the top of us. One of the girls, I cannot remember her name, gasped and started to shake as the great something seemed ready to smash us flat. She tried to bolt, but Stropikov's voice cracked like a whip, freezing her in mid-flight.
Do not move a muscle. You will not ruin my vision, Tulmoth. Not tonight.
She squeaked, seeming to be on the verge of tears, and I looked over to see Stropikov with a small gleaming pistol in his hand. As the shadowy mass descended from the ceiling, I saw what it was an instant before it encircled us. It was a glass chimney, like the ones on top of a lantern. The runner, Ingrid, her name was Ingrid, looked enchanted as the milky glass hemmed her in. Her terror had turned to rapture as she looked at the glass prison that now encased us. She stepped shyly towards it, hands outstretched, and when the music started, she missed her cue. The rest of us began to dance, 14 moths in hectic flight. We had been trained to stay within the confines of the stage. A silver circle had been built into the stage just inside the ring of lamps, and it acted as our perimeter. We'd been instructed not to cross that silver ring, but Ingrid was prepared to do just that. It wasn't really her fault. Ingrid was 15, too young to be involved with something like this. She was tough, though. I suppose she had to be to make it this far. She was young, though, and her youth meant that she was still prone to fancy. As we danced, I heard many of them hiss for her to get back into position. We had taken wing, dancing and flapping as we gyrated around our glass prison. As I danced, I saw the eyes of the crowd find us, find me, their Lady Zunni. Stropikov had placed me in the middle of the swarm, giving me a position of prominence. My costume had an eye pattern on the wings, a long flowing stripe that crested the tips, and I stood out amongst my plain white counterparts. As I danced, for the sea of lacquered masks, I could almost imagine them transformed into the rich and affluent men and women of high society that would grace the seats of the Moscow theater, or even the Grand Russian ballroom. I was alone on that stage, dancing my heart out, and the crowd would applaud and cheer and shower me with their praise. I would perform for kings, for lords, just like Madame Grutiev had, and the whole world would know that my star shone above all others. I didn't see when Ingrid stepped too close to the oil lamps, her small hand reaching out to touch the delicate glass. I did not see when her leg set afire as it came in contact with the flame. I saw her when she burst into flames, going up like a real moth when it has kissed the fire within the lamp. Her screams echoed off the glass walls, and the pandemonium erupted soon after. Ingrid ran towards the others, her high angelic voice slipping across our senses like a razor. She ran towards the closest dancer, arms open as she begged to be saved or killed, or whatever hope she'd hoped to find there. As they touched, the girl's face an O of surprise. Her costume erupted in flames, and she fell into another. That one lit as well. The two beside her went next, then the two beside her, and so on, and so on. From the center of the dancers, I was trapped in a glowing pyre of flames and screams. It was chaos, girls running and beating at the glass, some still twirling and dancing drunkenly as they burned. I expected the glass to rise, I expected the crowd to come to our aid, but as I watched, I knew this was what they had been waiting for. They were all on their feet now, clapping and cheering as though this were the finest performance they'd ever seen. Stropikov came from backstage, and the applause reached a fever pitch as he raised his hands magnanimously.
Thank you, thank you. Any sacrifice for the sake of art. Any sacrifice for the sake of art!
They were on their feet, their cheers and applause inaudible from inside the dome. They cheered as we died, and I felt certain that this would be the end of me. As the smoke and stench surrounded me, I saw someone in their midst who did not belong. He was tall, taller than a man had any right to be, draped in a ratty black suit and gloves that hung in rags from his two thin fingers. It seemed like I could hear his clapping above the others, the only one I could hear clearly, and as his hands came together one last climactic time, he lifted one of them to his mask. It was different from the others, a grinning fool done in red and black, and as it came away, I saw an equally happy skull beneath. The black eye sockets seemed to wink at me, and the bright white skull grinned merrily. As I lost consciousness amid that hell of running bodies, his was the last thing that I saw. When I awoke, I was laying in the street behind the theater. My clothes had been badly burned. My hair was gone, burned away in the flames, but I was untouched and unhurt so far as I could tell. Several of Stropikov's assistants were moving the bodies from the theater, putting them in the alley behind, and the blackened corpses made me realize how lucky I had been. I was the only survivor of Stropikov's moths of flame. He was never convicted of the 14 girls he burned alive. I know that Madame Grutiev was paid handsomely for her dancers, and I can only assume that the other studios who put forth girls were equally compensated. Before you say that this could not be, that no one would possibly fail to notice 14 missing girls in a city like Moscow, you should remember that this was Russia in the early 20s. World War I had only ended a few years ago, and people disappeared every day. Disappearances were still something not wholly uncommon there. Russia was a hard place to live, even in places like Moscow. People left for better things. People died in strange and horrifying ways. I certainly left when all of this was over. It was not so uncommon to find bodies in the canals and back alleys. I went to Madame Grutiev's studio. When she saw me, she wept. I had no idea he would do such a thing. How was I to know what a monster he was? She gave me the money I had made from the performance, the money that would get her out of debt, and told me to flee. Stropikov has powerful friends who make the ones I owe money to look like minnows to a whale. Take this money, take the money that Louise died for, and build a new life somewhere where things like this do not happen. What about you? I asked her, but she only smiled. I'm going somewhere beyond them. She killed herself later that night, drank poison in her office or some such thing. Georgette found her the next day, but I was on my way elsewhere by then. She found me years later and wrote to tell me these things. She mourned us, those dead and those gone, and told me she still ran the studio where Madame had always loved to be. Stropikov continued to produce shows until 1955. A group of men came to get him after one of his performances, killed 8 girls, and burned a field of wheat to cinder. I think they were probably madder about the wheat than the girls, but they hung him from a nearby tree in the field. and it was too quick for the likes of him, if you ask me. I never danced under Madame Zunni again. She died in Moscow, in the fire that killed so many. We sat there in the ensuing silence, the crackling fire, the only sound other than the shallow respirations of me and my great-grandmother. Did you ever see him again? No, she said, but I never forgot that grinning apparition or the clear regard he had for me. I attribute my long life to that night. I stood before death, and he tipped his head to me. When I see him again, I want him to see that I was worthy of his regard. The two of us sat looking at the fire for quite some time, my sleep forgotten as I watched the cinders dance, becoming ghost moths.
I envy these kids nowadays. That probably makes me sound like an old fart, but they really do have a lot more options than we did when we were their age. My youngest is neurodivergent, while my oldest has ADHD, which is bad enough to sometimes give him terrible anxiety. We have any number of things around the house to help with said anxiety. Poppets, fidget spinners, fidget cubes, sensory blankets, you name it, and we probably have it somewhere. My youngest son picked them up early, and they seemed to help him cope with the stress that his autism often brought on. My oldest scoffed at the gadgets my son had, but he left them lying around, and my oldest started playing with them too. Now he doesn't go anywhere without his fidget cube, and his hands seem glued to it around test time. All I had when I was his age was a worry stone, and I probably worried away more than a quarry of them. So when my youngest left his Karmagami on the living room floor one afternoon, my first exposure to it wasn't exactly positive. If you're unaware of what those are, they're these little revolving toys that have different patterns on each of the faces. As you rotate it, the picture changes, and the transitioning images are supposed to be soothing. That, however, was not my initial reaction to them. He had left it in the living room floor beside the couch, right in a blind spot. So as I came around the corner one day, wanting to get a little lunch from the kitchen, I stepped down on the pokey end of the toy. After a few minutes of cursing and hopping around, I was ashamed to see that I had broken my son's new favorite sensory toy. I looked at the time and realized I only had about an hour to find a new one before he came home and had a fit. Quick trip to Walmart and $10 bought me an exact copy, but before I could leave, one of them caught my eye. It was a galaxy scene, the stars and nebulas giving me a strange, serene feeling. I decided to buy one for myself, feeling a little silly for wanting a kid's toy, but getting over it pretty quickly. As I sat at my desk and flipped through the scenes of open space, I felt a serenity I hadn't known since I was very young. I have a certain amount of anxiety myself, and the weird rotating thing soothed me when it all became too much. My wife rolled her eyes at me a little, but I noticed she wasn't in any hurry to get rid of her fidget cube either. So it sat on my desk, and there it was well used and well loved. At least, until recently. I've been working on a book for the last couple of years, and it was finally beginning to come together. It was polished. The test readers I'd let have a look at it said they couldn't wait for the next chapter, and I was excited to get the final draft to my editor after so long. As I edited it, the little toy became the object most often at hand. I would turn it over and over without thinking about it, the galaxy spinning as my tale spun itself closer and closer to completion. I was turning it as I worked my way through the last fourth of the book, when something besides the swirl of the heavens caught my eye. I looked down, seeing the corner of the starry sky, and then I saw something on the face that was not the Galileo space probe or a black hole. It was eyes. I dropped the thing in surprise, but I had definitely seen a pair of bloodshot eyes. I could swear the veins had pulsed a little, the pupils staring at me, and I had been so startled by the intrusion that I picked my feet up into my chair like I thought it might bite me. I reached down after a few seconds of sitting like that, feeling silly, and when I picked it back up, I could see the familiar black hole and space probe among the bed of stars. I shook it off, thinking I'd just been working too hard. Started flipping the little toy in my hand again. As the words began to fall comfortably into place, I forgot about the eyes. I put it off as an optical illusion. It kept spinning and spinning, stopping only to make edits or change something here and there, and I didn't think about it again until later that night. I was talking with my editor on the phone, telling her about my progress and playing with the Karmagami, when it happened again. I figured I've got about 10 more chapters before I'm done with the third draft. I think then I might be ready to pass it to the proofreader so we can make it ready for publication. The absent-minded flipping was cathartic, my hands busy as my mind whirled over the things I still needed to do. I had to finish the second draft, get the cover art finished, get the final page count, and as I thought about it, my fingers flicked the little toy around and around. The spacescape spun faster and faster, the stars practically winking as I talked to Edith about the upcoming book. I'd forgotten about the eyes, chalking it up to stress, and the little thing hadn't been far from my hand since. "That's great, kid. If they're anything like the last pages you sent me, I can't wait to see them. Did you fix the problem you've been having with the third part?" "Yeah, I think so. I changed it so Mark and Ted move away while he kills Taylor. But the little toy had nearly slipped through my sweaty fingers, and I looked down to see the eyes staring up at me again. They were boring into me, judging me as they glared daggers into my Notre Dame t-shirt. As I watched the eyes, something emerged from the lower lip of the device, and I yelped as something bit me. I dropped the Karmagami and the phone I was talking on, looking down at my bleeding thumb as I shuddered on the couch. My wife and youngest son looked over at me, not sure what had happened, and I heard Edith from the floor asking what was going on. I reached for the phone, but my hands were shaking as the bite on my thumb bled. I apologized for the surprise, but the rest of my answer was a little less excited. When I felt my thumb throb, I looked down to find that the thing was back in my hand. I wanted to drop it, but I just couldn't make my hand release it. The space scene was back again. The eyes and teeth were gone, but my hands shook a little as I flipped through the pictures. I spoke absent-mindedly to Edith, but my eyes kept flicking down to the little puzzle toy. I expected to see the eyes again, but when the call ended, I let the phone slide down to the cushions and took the Karmagami in both hands again. "Boy," my wife said, "you sure are interested in that thing tonight." I nodded, but I felt a little cold as I kept flipping. My fingers felt crampy as I spun the image, unable to stop myself, and it no longer brought me the peace of mind that it once had. This was more like the feeling I used the device to forget, and the longer I held it, the more it made the emotions in me circle like a tornado. I had eyes only for the changing colors and patterns, and as they scrolled, I saw the depths of space open up, and the eyes returned to judge me. They swirled like galaxies all their own, the white orbs climbing up out of the depths of the void. The veins pulsed in the pale pools, beating to the tune of their own phantom heartbeat. I wanted to stop, but I was powerless as I saw that Cheshire Cat's smile oozing up as well. The teeth grinned wetly, drawing up at the corners as they ogled me. The teeth groaned like trees in a high wind, the mouth becoming a rictus as it continued to grow. The closer it came, the faster my hands moved. My fingers cramped, but they still worked as a blurry mechanism, faster and faster, closer and closer, the eyes and mouth rising from the void as my movements seemed to summon them into the world. I couldn't tell if I was leaning in closer or they were getting bigger, but the longer I turned it, the more it encompassed my whole existence. When someone suddenly covered the object in my hand, taking it away from me in one smooth motion, I was both relieved and infuriated. I was in bed, completely unsure of how I'd gotten there, with my wife looking down on me with concern. "I think you've played with your toy enough for one night," she said, taking it over to my desk and setting it down. I smiled at her, a single tear sliding down my face, but inside, I wanted to jump up and throttle her. For the first time in my life, I wanted to hit her. I wanted to slam her head against the desk until she stopped moving, and then I wanted to pick up that toy and start moving the pieces again. I railed against the feelings, but they kept surging forward like eels just below the surface. She must have seen something when she looked back, because she paused before coming back to bed. Her look was strange, almost fearful, but she settled as I adjusted my face into something more normal. "What's gotten into you lately?" she asked, coming to bed as I pulled myself back to reality. "Just working too much lately," I stuttered, getting up as I got into my pajamas. Even as I got ready, I couldn't help but glance at the Karmagami. It was just sitting there, calling to me, begging to be touched, but I turned away as I went to lay next to my wife. The urge to hurt her had passed, and as we settled into bed, I felt like my old self again. I just needed a little distance from my favorite worry stone, and as I drifted off, I made a mental note to just let it sit there tomorrow. I closed my eyes and opened them in a dream void. I was floating naked in space, a long umbilicus sprouting from my navel. I was drifting, moving towards the last thing I expected to find out there. It got bigger the closer I floated, and I expected that it would suddenly burst open and reveal a bright flash of light. Maybe this was where the eyes came drifting from, though I'd certainly never seen it on the stickered background of my fidget toy. The door was massive, roughly 20 feet tall, and it only got bigger the closer I got. As it loomed up before me, I suddenly found myself not wanting to sit in that shadow. I didn't understand how it still had a shadow. Did things have shadows in space? I didn't know, but I didn't want to come anywhere near this thing, as little say as I seemed to have in the matter. It opened suddenly, as I had expected, bathing my eyes in star-dazzling light. As I shaded my eyes to see what was coming through, I saw those glittering teeth as they opened wide and came down loudly around me. I came awake with a deep gasp, finding only my sleeping wife in the dark room. It was still on the desk then, that hateful pyramid, but I don't believe it stayed there long. When I woke up the next morning, my fingers ached, and I was already spinning the galaxies in my hand. My arms were shaking from exertion, the eyes and mouth already growing as they threatened to break the bonds of the Karmagami. I threw it away before I could think better of it, and when it burst against the wall, my wife snorted before falling back asleep. I just sat there for a moment, hands extended, not sure where I'd found the nerve. It was the last thing I had wanted to do, but now that it was star-strewn pieces on the ground, I felt more at peace than I had in days. It couldn't haunt me anymore, couldn't make my fingers cramp, my head ache, but even as I slid back under the covers, I could feel my fingers wanting to work the puzzle yet again. When I woke up and found it sitting on the desk, right where my wife had left it, I almost cried. Over the next few days, the little thing was my obsession, despite my better judgment. If I was awake, the little puzzle was spinning, spinning, spinning in my hands. My pages were forgotten, my family ignored. I couldn't help it. My mind was consumed by nothing so much as freeing whatever was trapped inside this thing, even though I was truly terrified of it. I would come to the precipice, the eyes ready to pop free of the canvas which held them, only to drop it before the snapping teeth could bite me. I would resist its pull for a few minutes, an hour at the most, but then I'd come to and find it in my hand yet again. My wife stopped nagging me about it after the second day, just sighing disgustedly anytime she saw me fiddling with it. At some point, she left to take the kids to school, and they didn't come back. I was aware of them the same way I was aware that every 8 hours I needed to eat, but I don't think it truly registered as something to be worried about. The phone was ignored, sometimes my body functions as well, and before long I was simply sitting on the living room floor in my own filth, my fingers rustling the drapes a little as they worked the picture at an eye-watering pace. I'm in one of my little breaks now, the device thrown against the wall as I try to resist the urge to use it. I took the time to get this down, hoping it would find someone, anyone, who might be having a similar problem. Sometimes the things that bring us joy are also the thing that destroys us. I don't know what sort of otherworldly being resides in this hunk of plastic and adhesive pictures, but it gets closer and closer to being born every time I pick the Karmagami up. For your own sake, if you ever see the eyes, don't fall into the same trap that has me. If you see the eyes, throw it away and forget it by any means possible.
I'm standing on the International Space Station's revolving deck as I write this to no one in particular. Every 30 seconds, it rotates around so you can see the Earth as it hangs in space. I was entranced by the calm little ball of water and dirt from the first time I saw it. It's so easy to forget how chaotic it is down there. From the cold and silent reaches of space, you forget that the Earth is full of honking horns and screaming people. It's so easy to forget that terror exists in places other than Earth. I was honored, thrilled even, when they told me I had been selected to reside on the International Space Station. I'd been dreaming of space since I was a little kid. Like many kids my age, I had decided that I wanted to be an astronaut. Unlike many kids my age, though, I meant it. Every class, every grade, every extracurricular, and every internship had been tailored to get me to this point in my life. Every move I had ever made had brought me to this point, standing on the rotating viewing platform so I can watch the Earth circle around. At least, I could until about 8 hours ago. I awoke at 6 a.m., International Space Station time, as I do every day. I took my morning shower, made my first cup of coffee of the day, and walked into my kitchenette to make my breakfast. Then I took my breakfast to the rotating platform so I could eat it as I watched the Earth roll lazily by. But when I came to the platform that morning, I was in for a surprise. As I glanced out of the thick glass window, I was greeted with nothing. I could see a few satellites drifting lazily through the inky vortex. I could see the usual collection of debris just waiting to burn up in Earth's atmosphere. I could see the stars as they twinkled in the darkness of space. I could see the other planets as they winked further from the station. What I could not see was Earth. I can still see my broken coffee cup as it spreads its liquid across the floor. My overturned bowl of oatmeal is sitting near it. I'm standing not 10 feet away from the place I stood when I discovered there was no Earth. As I sit writing, I can hear the sounds of chaos that have invaded my once peaceful haven. The crew is going mad, running rampant with panic. They now know what it must feel like to be a newborn who's been clipped from his umbilicus. Hal laughed when I told him what I had seen. Hal is the communications officer for the station, and he thought I was joking with him. When it became clear that I wasn't joking, he tried to hail the command center in California, just to put my mind at ease. They would pick up, and I would see that the whole thing was just a big misunderstanding. When they didn't answer, he seemed unsure, but not alarmed. "That's just interference. I'll try the center in Florida," he said with a little laugh. No answer. He tried to hail system control in 5 different countries. No answer. We attempted to contact anyone within the sound of our voice, and also received no answer. Only then did he come to the observation deck with me and verify that there was no Earth. Someone's crying. I can hear them sobbing from the crew quarters as I sit and stare into the void. There were a lot of people mourning when the Earth disappeared. When I left my room and walked out here, I could see the signs of suicide as well. Ravita, one of our science team members, was lying on her bed as I walked by. The door was open, and she looked so peaceful as she lay there. Still, I knew she must be dead. A line of foam slid from the corner of her mouth, and her chest moved not at all. Others had hung themselves. You could see them hanging like strange wind chimes from the vents in their rooms. There were no firearms on the station, but I could hear the research lab table saw running full blast, and I could guess what sort of business it was doing. Others were using this as an excuse for bad behavior. The mess hall was full of people, eating the food stores and drinking what little alcohol we had available on the station. I was sure a certain amount of rape and murder were going on as well. As I stood there stargazing, though, it hardly seemed to matter. Very little matters now. We are adrift, our umbilicus cut, and we're all living on borrowed time. The air would cycle through the air handlers indefinitely. That was a given. But without food and water, we would die. Our food comes on a shuttle from Earth once a month. We were not equipped to grow our own food. No seeds, very little soil on board. Once our food is gone, we will starve. At the rate we were eating the food in the mess hall, we'd be lucky to have food for the week. I put a hand against the glass, momentarily dizzy. I see the red handprint left behind and know I have to finish writing this quickly. They've left me alone for now, but if the puddle of blood oozing into my chair is any indication, I don't have very long. Hal and I took our findings to the head researcher. Vaughn looked over the numbers, checked the data, and then came with us to the observation deck to see for himself. By this point, several of the researchers and the other station staff had gathered to look out into space, hoping to find that familiar blue orb we all loved so much. When they saw him, they all came to Vlan for answers. Vlan was stoic in the face of their fear, answering their questions evenly and putting their minds at ease. I'd known Vlan for years, an Israeli native drifting towards old age, and I had never seen him lose his cool. He didn't start now. I don't know what has happened, but I think what is important is that we not panic. We were hand-picked for this mission, and we must act like we deserve to be here. Go about your duties as you would any other day. When news surfaces, I will let everyone know. He called a meeting with Boggs, head of security, Mortimer, director of operations, Charlie, Hal, and myself. Charlie was my boss, the head researcher under Vlan, and very, very British. I believe the most important thing here is to maintain order. We have around 100 people on board, men and women, and if anarchy breaks out, then we may never over this. Over this? Mortimer asked skeptically. Pull your head out of your ass, Charles. The Earth is gone. We don't know that, Charles stated, wiping his bald head with a handkerchief. I've got eyes, same as you, and they tell me the Earth is not where it's supposed to be. Now, either we've drifted, or we aren't where we're supposed to be, or... Oh, don't pretend you know a damn thing about what's going on here, Charles shot back hotly. We pay you and your wrench jockeys to fix the air handlers, keep the pneumatic doors running, and maintain the systems on the station. You're no astronomer, Mortimer, not by a long shot. Mortimer turned red as he stepped closer to the blustery Englishman. Mortimer was no egghead, that was for certain, but he had served in 2 wars and was the most exceptional nuclear submarine tech the program could have laid hands on. He was also a bristling mass of service tattoos and sculpted muscle. I had seen him working out in the gym, giving the heavy bag a run for its money daily. Charles was about to learn what that bag knew for a certainty. Just because I didn't go to some fancy university doesn't mean I'm country dumb, you little insect. Gentlemen, please, Vlan shouted, bringing the 2 back to their senses. We have a problem, and your fighting is not helping. We have not drifted. Our telemetry tells us that we are occupying the same position in space that we've been holding since the beginning. We have not moved, unless our telemetry is wrong. It's not, Charles said smugly. Then something has happened to the Earth. It's our job to keep the peace, Mortimer. Tell your people to go about their tasks as they would. Boggs, tell your security staff to maintain order and not get too excited. I don't want public hangings, but I do want to see malcontents going to the brig. Charles, keep your people on task and keep their minds occupied. Maybe you could push forward our agricultural programs for the time being. Food may become a priority. Dismissed. He may have dismissed them, but their animosity remained. For the next few hours, tension slowly built between the science team and the maintenance team. Mortimer could be seen talking to his crew, casting dark looks at anyone from the science team that got too close. The talk was loud and angry, and many of Boggs' security crew would also be seen in these discussions. Boggs seemed to share Mortimer's outlook on the current situation. The two were soldiers, after all, and saw us as little more than egghead civilians who thought too much of themselves. Charles was just as bad. He sealed off the science lab and put us to work on greenhouse projects. He stormed around like a rat in a cage, snapping at people for no reason, and confiding to his group of favorites about the stupid roughnecks who thought they were better than us. He kept looking towards the door fervently, and I knew he was thinking the same thing I was. Boggs had an override key to all the doors on the station, and if those roughnecks decided that they wanted into the lab, there wasn't a goddamn thing we could do about it. At 10:30, Vlan called Charles. The two had a very heated discussion, as quietly as possible, of course, but it was evident that something was going on. Charles turned pale towards the end, and his eyes kept slipping back to the door. He was afraid of something out there, more fearful than I'd ever seen him. When the phone suddenly went dead, he put it in the cradle with all the reverence of a casket going into the ground. They made their move around noon. We had heard some dissident noises from outside, but Charles wouldn't let us leave. He told us to keep working and never mind what we heard. The missing members were not commented on. They had never shown up this morning, but we all just kept doing our best. As the noises came closer, I saw many of the scientists looking anxiously at the door. We all glanced over when it opened, and our fear was realized. In walked 8 members of Boggs' security detail, followed by Mortimer and 8 of his maintenance crew. As I mentioned, there were no guns on the station, but they all had batons or wrenches or knives from the kitchen tucked into their belts. They blocked the door as they fanned out, and it was apparent what they intended to do. Charles was livid. "What are you about? We're performing serious work in here, so if you could just—" "By order of Overseer Boggs, we are taking the science team into custody," Mortimer announced, a huge grin spreading across his face. "Overseer? Vlan will have something to say about this. When I tell him what you've done, he'll—" But as he approached Mortimer, the big man swung a monkey wrench he'd had in his hand and scattered Charles's teeth and blood across the lab. Charles fell like a sack of oats, and pandemonium ensued. We all broke, making for the door and hitting the wall of guards. I don't remember how I got away. All I remember was a brilliant flash of pain in my side, and someone bumped me hard. Suddenly I was in the hall, running for Vlan's quarters. The corridor rang with screams and noise. People were running as other science teams were being rounded up by security staff. As I ran, dodging groups of security staff as they chased others, I was aware again of the pain in my abdomen. That's when I looked down and saw the handle sticking out of my side. The blade it was attached to was long and sharp, a kitchen knife used for boning fish. When I pulled it out, it was red with my blood, and the blood wasted little time in dribbling out of the new hole. I shrugged out of my lab coat and tried to tie it off like a tourniquet, but it did little more than give the blood something new to stain. I felt a little dizzy. I wanted to sit down, but I knew this was the wrong time to do it. I kept going, hoping Vlan would bring peace to the station, but I already feared what I would find when I got to his office. I didn't even have to go in to see what they'd done to him. He was slumped over his desk in a pool of his own blood. Someone, probably Boggs, had cut his throat for him and left him where he lay. I turned to go, and at that minute, I think I was already planning on coming here to die. I dropped the knife on the floor and walked unnoticed through the hall. I saw bodies, I heard the screams, but I was ambivalent to them, as I was to the vacuum outside. I couldn't help them, and they couldn't save me. So, what was the point of belaying the inevitable? My eyesight is getting foggy now. I think I came here hoping to see Earth blink back into existence before I die. I don't know if I really was or not, but it would make me feel better to know that there still is an Earth out there. As chaotic as those billions of humans are, I don't think I want the few of us still alive here to be what my species will be judged by. They've proven that humanity, even the best of humanity, will revert back to apes at a moment's notice. Survival of the fittest, even in space, is not a hallmark I want on display, but it seems to be what this station's history will be left with. I'm going I'm going to sleep now. My fingers are numb. The rest seems like a good idea. If this is truly my final message, then take some solace in knowing that I died doing what I loved. I died among the stars, hoping for hope for the earth and its people.
My dad died nearly 2 years ago, and we just buried him today. He was a writer, though you've probably never heard of him. He was known in small circles, celebrated by the community where he lived, but his books will likely never grace the shelves of Barnes & Nobles. I say that like it's a fact, but that may not be the case anymore. Dad, much like one of those painters from the 1800s, became infinitely more famous in his death than he ever was in life. People who wouldn't return his calls, wouldn't even think of publishing his work, now come to see him from miles away. This probably seems strange, given that I just told you that he's dead, so let me start at the beginning. Dad died as he lived, at his keyboard. He's been writing the same book for as long as I can remember. It's a massive 7 or 8 volume series. In one of my earliest memories, I can remember toddling into his office and looking up at him as he smiled down at me, his fingers never leaving the keyboard as he plinked away. Dad wrote other things for magazines or freelance work, but the books were his magnum opus. He would tell anyone who would listen, usually interested friends of mine who were aspiring writers themselves, how the book would be the greatest work once it was done. He had envisioned 10 books in all, detailing the hero's journey of his main character as he attempted to find his father's murderer across several continents, meeting people and finding clues along the way. I've heard him talk about that book almost every day since I was old enough to understand what he was talking about, but I couldn't tell you much about them. He never let anybody read them. He was so protective of them. I don't know more than a dozen people who were aware of its existence at all. That being said, he was always in his study when he had time, tapping away at the keys and refining his manuscript for the day that it would be picked up by an editor. I was the one who found him, and it will haunt me for the rest of my life. I was getting ready for college, packing up my things, moving out, and I came to see if he would help me move some furniture onto the truck. He'd been in his office all day, and I kind of thought maybe he was mad at me. I know he didn't want me to leave. He was sad to see me go, but he had to understand that I had to go to college. I had a full-ride scholarship. I'd be a fool not to use it, and living on campus would give me access to resources I wouldn't have at home. It seemed like the best choice to move out, and I couldn't believe he couldn't see that. So when I stuck my head in and asked him, I was surprised when he didn't turn around. That only seemed to cement in my head the idea that he was mad at me. He had his back to the door, as he always did, fingers tapping away, and when he didn't say anything, I just stood there and looked at the back of his head for a moment. He had a bald spot forming, the hair receding away from the center, and I thought it was a little sad to watch my dad aging in such an obvious way. I asked him again, his fingers never slowing, but when he didn't say anything, I just went downstairs and managed to manhandle the desk into the U-Haul by myself. I decided I wouldn't bother him if he wanted to act like this. He would fold when it came time for me to leave, apologizing for acting like this, and we would have a hug before I drove off into the sunset. Around lunchtime, I looked at my now empty room and realized I was finished packing. Mom was at work at the post office, and I had planned to swing in and say bye on my way out of town. We had said our goodbyes that morning, with a lot of tears and hugging over breakfast, and Dad was the only one I still needed to say goodbye to. So I went upstairs again, saying I needed to leave and wondering if he'd give me a hug. His fingers just kept tapping away uninterrupted. "Come on, Dad," I said, stepping inside as he continued to ignore me. "I know you're bummed about this, but it's time for me to get out of here and make my own way. It's not like I'll never see you again. I'll be here for Thanksgiving. That's less than..." But when I put my hand on his shoulder, I noticed how cold it was. Dad had been up here for 3 days writing, and Mom said she didn't think he'd come to bed in all that time. That wasn't uncommon for Dad. He would hyperfixate on a project, or revisions for days at a time. His office was towards the back of the house on the 2nd floor, so without foot traffic or noise, he could lose himself for days as he worked. He usually came down for food after everyone was asleep, but I couldn't remember hearing him stumble around lately. I turned him towards me, his hands moving comically in front of him as he swung away from the desk, and as he came away, he began to scream as if someone was stabbing him. I stumbled away, taking in his long face and sunken eyes, and found myself running from the room as I grabbed the phone out of my pocket. Mom said she'd be home immediately, and as I waited downstairs, I could still hear him screaming in his office. She came home in a rush, going up the stairs 2 at a time, and when the screaming finally stopped, I breathed a sigh of relief. When she came downstairs, she asked me to come to his office. "I need to talk to you about something, and I think this should be a family decision." I came back to see that Dad was still staring at the screen of his MacBook, tapping away like we weren't even there. "I don't know how to explain this, but your father's dead." Looking at his fingers as they went about their tireless typing, I asked if she was kidding. Dad was clearly alive. His hands were moving, and I could see words on the screen forming coherent sentences. Were they playing a joke or something? None of what she was saying made any sense. I checked his pulse. He has no pulse, no vitals. He's gone, sweetie. But it appears that he's not quite gone. She tried to move him, and as she turned him away from the computer, I could see his lifeless face as it turned to regard me. His jaw had been hanging slack, his eyes open and staring, and as his hands came away from the keyboard, he started screaming all over again. It was deep and tortured, similar to the one he'd made before, and without even meaning to, I turned him back to the keyboard where his hands started typing again. I asked her what was going on, and Mom shrugged as she tried to come up with a reason for this. His book was important to him. You know that. I think maybe once he finishes it, he might stop on his own. I can't explain what's happening here, but I don't want him to die with his work unfinished. Your father kept saying it wasn't ready, but I'm going to send the first manuscript to his editor. Maybe once he sees it and someone puts it into print, he'll finally be able to rest. Either way, let's keep this between us, okay? I want your father to pass on without regrets, don't you?" I nodded, telling her of course I did. I wanted Dad to die in peace. "Then do him this last favor, and don't tell anyone what you've seen here. Promise?" I really didn't know how to feel about this, but I told her I wouldn't tell anyone, and she thanked me as she hugged me goodbye. I left in my U-Haul, unsure how to feel about the situation, but I kept the secret. I didn't come home for the next year. I came home for Thanksgiving, as promised, but the whole thing felt uncomfortable. Mom and I sat downstairs eating, her curious about how school was going, and me filling her in on my studies. As I ate turkey and tried to have a normal conversation over stuffing, all I could focus on was the tap-tap-tapping from upstairs. Mom had closed the door to Dad's office, something that I could never remember happening at any time in my life. But despite her best efforts, the tapping was still audible. There was a smell from the room at the end of the hall, and I was worried about her living in a house with a decomposing body. She said he hadn't decomposed much, but I think she might have been trying to spare my feelings. Worse than the smell, though, was the tapping. It never stopped. It sounded too loud to be from whole fingers. Despite this, Mom was in pretty good spirits. She said that Dad's first book was being edited, and his publicist thought it was likely to be ready for shelves by next year. He couldn't believe my dad had been keeping this gem to himself for so long, and I think that's when I really realized how few people Dad had shared his book with. She said the initial payment on the book had allowed her to pay some overdue bills, and she would send him the second book sometime next year. If I release them slowly, it won't seem so odd when he finishes, and I let them know that he's passed. I asked if his writing had slowed at all, and she said that he was typing all day and night. He never rests, and I've had to start sleeping in my noise-canceling headphones. The sound takes some getting used to, but I think I can put it out of my mind. I had meant to stay the week, but I ended up making excuses and leaving the day after Thanksgiving. The sound of the keys as they clicked away was becoming too much for me to handle. After that, I made excuses not to come home. I told Mom I had a paper due during Christmas and stayed on campus over the holiday. I took extra classes so I didn't have to come home on the semesters that I'd be able to take a break from. I still called her on the phone, but her conversations became shorter and shorter as time went on. The longer I was on the line with her, the more pervasive the clicking became, and it felt like I could hear it over the phone no matter where she was. Mom's mental state began to deteriorate as well. She'd sent the second book to his publicist, and he'd fast-tracked it after the first one had done so well. She deflected any sort of interviews or phone calls for Dad, telling them how shy and anxious he was. But people really seemed to want to pick his brain about the direction of the books, and they were becoming harder and harder to put off. She didn't sound like her usual self either. It was clear that she wasn't sleeping. She said the clicking was getting louder and louder the longer it went on. I tried to do some soundproofing on the office, but it never seems to help. I can't stand to be in there for very long. Even though he's looking at the screen, I can feel him watching me when I'm in there. I think I can hear something moving around at night, too. Mom took a deep breath, and I could almost see her looking in the direction of the office as she pitched her voice lower. I asked what she meant, afraid that maybe animals had gotten in to try to get at Dad's body, but she said it was just little sounds. You remember how he used to leave his office late at night to get food? Sometimes I feel like I can hear someone coming down the stairs in the wee hours of the morning. While I was listening to it the other night, I realized that I couldn't hear the keyboard anymore, and that scared me even more. She started crying then, and I think I had already decided to come home that weekend so we could sort this out. I hadn't come home in a long time, and I found a very different woman than the one I had found over Thanksgiving a year before. And why not? It had to be nerve-wracking, knowing you were sharing a house with a corpse. Mom looked like she had aged 20 years. Her hair, light blonde the last time I'd seen it, was threaded with gray and looked thinner than ever. Her skin sagged, and her eyes looked bruised from the bags under them. She was so thin to the point of emaciation, and I wondered if she had been eating. When she hugged me, I could feel her ribs pressing against me, and I decided then that something had to be done before I lost both my parents. I told her that we had to end this. I told her that we had to put him to rest, but she feebly resisted. He isn't done yet. He's still typing up there. I can't lay him to rest until he's finished. I asked her how long that would be, but she didn't seem to have an answer. I told her I was tired and wanted to rest, but after I heard her door close and the sound of her springs grumbling as she went to bed, I got up and went downstairs. I wanted to see what this thing was that was moving around after dark, and I knew just the place to hide. There was a small closet in the living room, a place for wrapping paper and old crafts Mom hadn't gotten around to yet. And after sliding some things around, I made myself comfortable and cracked the door. It took some time. I wished I had some coffee to keep me from dozing in the small, warm place. I was just starting to nod off, my phone showing 3:30 in the morning, when the landing at the top of the stairs creaked. Something glided down almost soundlessly, its body light as I pressed my eye to the slit in the door to see what it was. It was dark in the living room, the curtains drawn, but I didn't dare turn on my light. If it knew I was here, it might flee, and then I'd have nothing to report to Mom in the morning. Luckily for me, it jostled right past the closet door, and the creature was impossible to miss. It was thin, almost lacking dimensions, creaking as it ambled into the kitchen. I held my breath as it disappeared into the dim space, but the pale head was hard to miss. When it turned to look at the closet from the kitchen doorway, I feared I'd made a noise. When those empty eye sockets fixed on the door, I covered my mouth with my hands. When the creature creaked its way into the kitchen and disappeared from sight, I tripped out of the closet and made my way less than gracefully back up the stairs and into my old room. If it heard me, it didn't stop at the door to comment. Only then did I come to the same conclusion that my mother had, realizing what was missing from the silent house. The tapping had stopped. We called the police the next day, me threatening to call them myself if Mom didn't. I didn't know what that thing was I'd seen the night before in the kitchen, but I couldn't very well leave her alone with it. She just nodded and picked up the phone. I think she was ready to call them, honestly. She lived with Dad's corpse for 2 years, and even she had to agree it was time to end it. The paramedics weren't sure what to make of him, but he was definitely what I had seen the night before when it came into the kitchen. He had almost completely rotted, but his bones had moldering flesh still attached in places. His scalp had some hair clinging to it. The bald spot I had noticed was still visible, but we had taken his hands off the keyboard before they got there. When we had taken him from the computer, his scream was little more than a wheeze of protest. He had no vocal cords to scream with, but still, he protested. The police had questions, but I think Mom managed to convince them that it was all harmless. She said that when he died, she had just gone a little bit crazy. She couldn't cope with him being gone, so she just pretended he was in his office, typing away on his novel. I told them that that was what she had told me for months, and I think they believed me. Dad's remains were taken to the funeral home, and it goes without saying that his funeral was a closed casket affair. As we sat on the front row, though, I heard something that would haunt me until I went into the ground myself. Dad may not have been able to scream, but it seemed his work went on regardless. As I sat there with Mom, my mother sobbing as she heard the all-too-familiar sound, we both heard the low tapping of those bony fingers smacking against the lid of the coffin. I can only assume that they still press against the lid even now. My father's last story, worn into the wood of his coffin.
I sighed as I saw the toll booth looming up in front of us. My wife and I had driven down this road 1,000 times in the 10 years we'd been married. It was actually the place we took our first date, and we loved to drive down it on Sundays and feel nostalgic. Despite the number of times we've driven the long and winding route, the toll booth always surprises me a little. It sounds weird to say that our first date was a drive, but I think it was honestly pretty sweet. I'm a photographer, have been since I was 19, and I often shoot weddings and family photos for people in the area. I've got an amazing eye for location, and my photos have been featured in not just people's homes, but also in magazines that debut the beauty of North Georgia and the Carolinas. The Appalachians have been my home since I was born, and I know how to bring out her beauty in my photos. I was 22 and on my way to a wedding when I spotted a car on the side of the road with a young woman sitting on the hood. She waved her hands at me, asking if I would stop, and I rolled down my window to see if I could help. She said her car had broken down and was wondering if I could help her out. I'm no mechanic, and my car knowledge stops at changing my oil, so I offered her a ride to the wedding I was attending so she could call a wrecker. She agreed and ended up hanging out with me the whole wedding. The wrecker couldn't get there for 3 or 4 hours, and I was the only person that she knew. So, in between photo shoots, we talked. I got her some food. Weddings usually have a little extra, and this one was more of a country union than a black tie affair. We sat around and chatted as I took some candid shots. We discovered that we actually had a lot in common, and when the wrecker called her, she told him to just drop it off at her mechanic. I drove her home afterwards and invited her to dinner with me later that week. I know what you'll say, it wasn't a real date, but it meant something to us, and we've considered it our first date for years. We even went back on our first anniversary to put a marker where her car had broken down. It may be a little macabre, but we put a wreath there to commemorate her little coupe. It had died on that spot the day we met. We still keep that wreath up. We stop at it sometimes so we can remember how we came to know each other. The spot where her car died is about 2 miles from the toll booth. The toll booth is an oddity. It's just a random toll booth out in the middle of the woods. You put 50 cents in the basket, the booth is never manned, and you head on your way. I have no idea who comes to collect the money. I don't imagine it makes a lot of it, but it's probably some senator's nest egg for when he gets put out of office. We always keep change in the car for just such an occasion, not minding paying a little toll to see the road that started our happy life. Today, however, I couldn't find 50 cents in the cup holder. It's been a busy week. We just put a down payment on our new house, my wife just started a new job, and I had just finished shooting a big wedding that more than paid for the down payment on the new house. But it left us a little light otherwise. We had cashed in our change jar that sat in the cup holder, something to get us by till payday, and I had forgotten to put more change in it afterwards for the toll road. The drive was kind of our date night this weekend. We had a picnic in the back seat, and we were going to go up to the lake where the wedding had been held. The lake was where we had our own wedding, and we went there often to picnic or swim or just enjoy a quiet afternoon together. "What's the matter?" Carol asked. I dug a nickel out from between the seats and weighed the pathetic little pile of change. 5 pennies, 2 dimes, and a nickel were all I had managed to find under the seats. The arm hung stoically across the road, little more than a wooden suggestion than a real barrier. I had thought many times that I could probably just drive through it and be done with the stupid thing, but such things were a little too rebellious for me. "You got any change?" I asked, doubting she did, but wanting to be sure. "No," she said, looking through her purse before exclaiming, "Aha!" and dropping another nickel onto my palm. "Well, that's a little better, but it's not quite 50 cents. Just dig some out of the change cup," she said. I shook the cup at her, reminding that we had recently traded it in. "Oh yeah. Well, what shall we do, my dear?" I considered turning around, maybe just forgetting the whole thing, but a new idea suddenly bubbled to the surface. I pulled onto the soft shoulder of the road, the car protesting as much as my wife. I'm sure my car's wheels were going to bog down any minute. The shoulder of the road is soft turf and seed grass, and I expected my tires would spew up earth and stick. I'd have to sheepishly explain to some highway patrolman how I'd gotten stuck then. To my surprise, though, I drove easily around the barrier. I laughed and wondered why I hadn't simply done this before. "What are you doing?" my wife asked, half laughing but also half aghast. "We've given this thing 50 cents loads of times. I think it can give us a pass, just this once." We both laughed as we drove away from the lonely little toll booth, but I think even then, I felt a slight twinge on the back of my neck. I would remember it later and realize I had been warned. We drove down the familiar road, taking in nature's bounty and chuckling at our daring. The trees were ablaze with early fall oranges and deep, healthy greens. The sky was a perfect robin's egg blue, and I just knew that the lake would be wonderful today. We could watch the sunset, maybe have a little fire before going home, and snuggling in bed at the end of a perfect day. It was a good plan, but someone had a different one, it seemed. As we drove, my wife watched the leaves with interest. My wife is an unofficial leaf looker, though she would never admit it, and our house has many pictures of beautiful foliage. As I drove, the roads winding onward, I saw her lift her head from the car window and squint at the passing colors. We were both getting on in years, no spring chickens now, but the look she was giving the leaves was decidedly prudish. It was like an old maid who simply can't believe Miss Tyler let her daughter out in that skirt. "John, does something seem off about the trees?" she asked, sounding perplexed. I looked at the trees, the oranges and reds and greens looking completely natural to me, and I told her so. It does, but it doesn't. It's like seeing trees on television. They look kind of glossy, recorded even. I don't know how to describe it. They just look a little weird. I brushed it off, thinking maybe she was seeing things. It had been a long week, and we had been through some pretty stressful times. It was enough to make anyone a little jangled. She kept watching the trees, but I'd put my eyes back on the road, wanting to be there already. We had driven for about another 30 minutes, though, when I had to slow down. Sitting in the road, white and brown with a glossy oak arm, was the toll booth. I stopped and looked around, thinking somebody might be playing a little joke, but there was no one around. The toll booth looked exactly as it had before. It was simulated wood grain, and the walls were painted a dark brown and creamy white. The arm was simulated oak with a glossy finish. It looked exactly like the toll booth, but it couldn't be. Could it? Maybe they thought they'd put up another one, my wife asked, smiling but clearly confused. I laughed a little at that. They were getting a little greedy out here, weren't they? I pulled around this one too, and I watched it disappear in the rearview mirror as we made our way down the road. My wife was still looking raptly at the trees as we drove past, her attention becoming unhealthy. When she asked me to take a look, I glanced over to see the unusual reds and oranges and greens, but something did look a little off about them. Had they become even more vibrant? The foliage looked artificial, almost neon, and it battered against my eyes as we watched them go past. Okay, there's no way you can tell me that was just my imagination. I didn't answer her. I just wanted to get to the lake so we could have our picnic and all would be normal again. This was weird, yeah, but it was just a strange phenomenon. We would make it to the lake and everything would be okay. When we drove here next weekend, or the weekend after that, everything would be just as it had always been. I edged my speed up a little, wanting to pass the weird technicolor trees and get into the deep woods I knew were coming. We had driven for about another half hour when my brakes screeched against the pavement. I blinked. It just couldn't be. I had been driving these roads for 10 years, and it was always just the one toll booth. My wife seemed startled too, leaning forward to look unbelievingly at the little booth. It looked exactly like the other two, but that was impossible. We had passed it twice, and I was sure there was only one toll booth out here. There would be no reason to think a second one would make any difference. There was so little traffic out here. What the hell? My wife asked. And when I pulled around the arm this time, it was a little more aggressively than I meant to. Maybe, she started, pausing a little as she looked nervously at me. Maybe we should just pay the toll. I didn't say anything. I had been too mad to even acknowledge the prickle on the back of my neck this time. Stupid, money-grubbing jerks. They hadn't figured they could line their pockets enough with just one toll booth, so they had to have two more. This was unbelievable. I had a sense of humor about the first one, but if they thought they were going to gouge me for another toll, babe, they had another thing coming. I was going to write my congressman, my senator. I'd write the freaking president about this. They couldn't just, John, gouge people like this. What about tourism? What about local beauty spots? What the hell happened to bringing people out so they could, John! I stopped on the brakes and turned to yell, "What?" at my wife as she stared out the window. Normally, she would have chastised me for yelling at her. I don't think I had yelled at her more than a couple of times our whole marriage, but she was too shaken to even take notice. She was looking out the window, staring at the trees with the strange leaves and pointing with a shaky finger. Look, she stuttered, and I turned to see what she was babbling about. The leaves were still eye-destroyingly bright, but this time they were also melting off the trees. Not regular melting either, but like wet paint dripping off an oversaturated object. I could see them dribbling onto the ground, pooling on the grass as the verdant green lawns became spin art. I put my eyes forward, racing the engine, and tried to reach what I knew was ahead as fast as I possibly could. The toll booth came into view again, but I didn't stop this time. What are you doing?" my wife said, getting nervous as I didn't slow down. I gunned the engine, revving to 70 on the straightaway. "Stop it. Stop. Don't do that." The engine growled as I nudged it up to 80. "John," my wife screamed, but it was too late. I crashed through the wooden arm and laughed maniacally as the wooden pieces cascaded off the hood and flew to either side. I had made a lot of mistakes that day, but damaging the booth, that was the worst one. My wife screeched when I hit the arm, but one look at me had reduced her to silence. I glanced over at her and immediately felt sorry for what I had done. My foot came off the ignition and the car slowly spun to a stop in the middle of the two-lane road. I had damaged state property. I was sure there was some sort of camera on the booth somewhere, and it would be easy enough to see me ramming the arm. I thought about driving back to the booth and seeing if there was a number I could call to report the accident, but finally I just decided to keep going so we could make it to the lake before dark. As I drove, I realized my wife had been silent the whole time. I turned to tell her I was sorry, to apologize for going a little nuts back there, but she wasn't paying any attention to me at all. She was looking at the countryside as it rolled by. "Honey, I'm sorry about all that. I just let it all get to me. I'm sorry for yelling. Sorry for acting like a psycho. I was just so... The trees are wrong, John." Her voice sounded on the edge of hysteria. "What?" I asked, craning my neck around. "They're all dead. They're all dead, John." I turned right, wanting to see what she was talking about, but when I saw the trees, I wasn't sure why it had taken me so long to see. The trees, so vibrant and colorful before, were now sickly and forlorn. The vibrant colors had oozed right out of them, and the leaves hung limply from the trees as their bark hung pale and peeling. It wasn't just the trees either. The sky looked yellow and sick. It made no sense. What the hell was going on? This was nothing like how the road usually was. It was nothing like how it had looked the first time we'd seen the toll booth. I put my foot down on the ignition and we kept rolling forward towards our destination. It only got weirder the longer we drove. The longer we drove, the more I expected to run into that toll booth again. The longer I drove and didn't encounter that ramshackled booth, the more paranoid I became. The world outside didn't help much either. The sky became darker and darker as we went. The leaves began to drop from the trees in droves. The limbs were skeletal, the bark crumbling from the long, fragile limbs, and the farther we traveled, the more desiccated they became. We should have come to the deep woods by now. We should have come to the lake by now. We should have seen another car, seen a deer, seen something. My wife stopped looking out the window, and I kept sneaking glances at her to make sure she was okay. She just sat hunkered against the seat, rubbing her shoulders as she tried not to notice what was going on outside. I should have been worried about her. I should have stopped to make sure she was okay, but I was feeling on the verge of mental collapse myself. We never made it to our destination, little as I would have wanted to get out if we had. As the sun began to set, I realized how much worse it could get. "Honey," I whispered, not sure how long it had been since we'd spoken. It felt like days, weeks, but my mind railed against this idea. We were just a little lost on a road we had driven so many times we could have set the mile markers. I wasn't sure what was going on here, but I was sure that we would come out of it okay. "We shouldn't have driven around it." "What?" I asked, confused by her answer. "We shouldn't have hurt the toll booth." She turned towards me and she looked afraid. "We should have just paid the toll. Now it's mad, and it might never let us get off this road." "That's nonsense," I said, but it lacked conviction. I had been out here at night before, driving home after a day on the lake, but I had never seen it this dark. The trees no longer looked to be the old pines that I'd come to love. The trees I could see from the headlights looked more like maples, with a thick dark sap running out of them. If I looked too long at them, some of them even seemed to have faces. I always looked away when I noticed this, afraid to meet their gaze, but I could feel them looking at me nonetheless, challenging me to meet their eyes. As much as I wanted to tell her she was wrong, I couldn't argue the fact that we seemed to be stuck, and it had all started after we drove around the toll booth. "Quick, dig under the seat and see if you can find 15 cents. She looked at me in disbelief. "What? 15 cents? That way, if we see the toll booth again, we can pay the toll and get out of here," I nearly growled at her. She moved slowly, like someone in a dream. She began to search under the seats for change, and as she searched, I kept driving. I was beginning to believe that something outside the norm might be at play here, and the further we drove, the more I also believed that we were being followed. The moon hung overhead, the bright yellow moon like a kid's Halloween drawing, and by that popcorn yellow beam, I could see things running through the woods. They loped along like big dogs, their bodies oddly elongated, and their legs thick and long. I never got more than a quick look at them, but that look was enough. I think I see a quarter in the track of the seat, but I can't get it. Can you pull over so I can reach it?" I gritted my teeth, but a quarter would get us there for sure. I pulled over slowly, my lights still glaring into the woods, and told her to please be quick. My wife stepped out, getting down beside the car so she could reach below the seat. I glanced around nervously, watching the woods for signs of the creatures. My wife was saying how she almost had it, but it kept slipping through her fingers. I told her to be quick, and when I looked back at the tree line, I saw one. It was like a mountain lion that had been dipped in tar. It was like a massive cat with black ridges of overlapping plates. I imagined I could see the headlights reflected off its grinning mouth full of razor-sharp teeth, and its claws clicked impatiently on the edge of the pavement. "Carol," I whispered, not taking my eyes off the creatures. "I've almost got it," she growled through gritted teeth. The creature didn't seem to have eyes, but its head turned menacingly towards the car as Carol spoke. As the quarter came free, I reached down and grabbed her by the collar of her t-shirt, lifting her into the car. My wife isn't large, maybe 5 feet, but at that moment it wouldn't have mattered if she'd been a giant. I pulled her back into the car and pushed my foot down on the accelerator as hard as I could, the door bumping shut as we got back on the road. If I had hesitated even a moment longer, we'd likely be dead. As it was, I clipped the beastie in the side of the head instead of full in the side. The chest of the creature would have caved the front of my car in, but its head whipped heavily to the side as it broke one of the headlights. I barely noticed as I flew down the road at 70, the other creatures in hot pursuit. We were doing 90 as we barreled forward, but I could see the pack of nightmare hounds right behind us. The rear lights lit their chitinous faces hellishly, and I took the hairpin turns with wheel-screeching accuracy. I'm no NASCAR driver, but the sight of those creatures behind me was enough to push me onward. If they caught me, we'd both be dead. If I crashed, we'd both be dead anyway. Seemed like either way, our options were pretty limited. They followed us for a long while, too long for creatures their size. I was driving 90 most of the time, but they kept pace as easy as if I'd been going 20. I was keeping ahead of them, but only just. I felt them bump the back bumper more than once. They seemed intent on forcing me off the road, but they couldn't quite hit hard enough to force me off. My wife shuddered every time we got hit, and I found myself barely able to keep it on the road after every successful strike. After some indiscriminate amount of time, I looked in the rearview mirror to find that we were alone again. A few minutes later, I saw the toll booth come up into view, but not the one I was used to seeing. This toll booth was black, the paneling looking like the skin on those creatures, and the arm looked like an unprocessed tree trunk. I didn't hesitate. I dropped the money into the basket, whispering sorry as the arm slid up to permit us. We pulled through the turnstile, and it was like crossing some kind of barrier into another world. My grandmother had grown up in Ireland and had sometimes told me stories about people who crossed the barrier between their world and into the realm of Fae. Grandma always said that people could cross into the fairy realm without realizing it, but I knew all too well when I crossed the border out of whatever place we had been in. It was like passing under the coldest waterfall I could imagine. We got home without incident, but it's the craziest thing. We had voicemails from our friends, a client, and even my wife's new job, asking where we were and why we'd been gone for so long. It seemed that even though we had left just after lunch on Sunday, we didn't return till Tuesday night. The car's still damaged, so I know we didn't imagine it. The car is damn near out of gas, and the oil shows that it's almost due for an oil change, despite having been done less than a month ago. I don't know what the hell happened to us, but I know I'll be keeping money in the cup holder from now on. Whether we ever choose to go down that road again or not, I will always have money to feed the toll booths that may appear in my life. You never know where they might take you if you don't play by the rules.